Welcome to the podcast, Jason. How are you doing?
David, doing well. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. I'm good. Here's one of the first things I wanted to say. Jason Valentino is a really, really cool name. I don't know if anybody has complimented you before on that.
Thanks. No, yeah. I am blessed with a
Okay.
great last name and can't speak Italian at all, which is quite upsetting to go along with it. I'm actually Jason Dante Albert Valentino,
Oh, wow.
and
Okay.
yeah, I'm as Americanized as you possibly could get with a name
But
like
you
that.
know what the name kind of reminds me of? If you have like a band, like a 90s or, well I would say 70s, 80s band, and then if you say you are a main vocalist for that band, that's a fitting name actually. Jason Valentino opening for this band or something like that.
I'll take a note of that. That's a good. I've been thinking about what to do next in my career, so maybe that's where
That's
we go with it.
awesome. Well, I would say first of all, it's so great to have you on the podcast. I mean, I've heard so many great things about you, and I've been following some of the things that you've been doing on LinkedIn. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. And right now, I think what your current role is, you're the head of engineering enablement at BNY Mellon, which is like a new gig that you just started. Tell us a little bit more about where you are right now and what led you to that opportunity.
Well, I just started. I actually just completed my first month at BNY. It's a slightly new role for the organization where, like most companies, there's a team that is managing dev tooling. There's teams that are doing automation, cloud, and whatnot. And there's a lot of there's a lot huge desire for reuse throughout the company. And they've really been debating how do you actually measure developer effectiveness and happiness. And it's just one of those things where I think the internal debates turned on to a point where they're like, we should probably find someone that's done this before. And then my manager Mike Kessler somehow found me through the DevX network, and so it's just one of those unique situations where I'm talking to the highest levels of leadership in the company, and they absolutely have a passion for this. Whereas normal companies, when you are the DevX person, you're always having to sell up. Always, you're like, hey, here's the value we can get. Just do this at X, Y, and Z. And so, just the idea of having a company where I'm starting with tailwinds behind me is absolutely exciting. Now, I did promise myself I'd never go back into banking after working, in banking for a dozen years. And we all lie to ourselves, so it's fine. It's fine. I didn't break any core tenets here.
Yeah, and as long as the paycheck is good, right? So
Yeah. There you go.
yeah. So you've had a really amazing, fascinating career, like almost 20 plus years of career. But the last 10 years of your career has been really fascinating, right? Working, you were the number third employee at Capital Labs that produced some amazing, results
Yeah.
for
I was
Capital One.
on the tech side. The product grew quicker than tech did, but yeah, I was like probably number three in Cap One's original, like now what they consider their Cap One Labs or the innovation lab back in the day, ran their most of their infrastructure functions. And so it was kind of like, this is so long ago, but over a decade ago, the bank's policy on things like cloud or big data was no. Like, don't touch it. Don't talk to vendors who touch it. And we ran the first like set of exceptions around those. Experimented with the cloud. Inevitably, sat there in front of Cap One CEO and showed off the technology that, years later is now the only way to get anything done in the company. I think they shut down their last data center maybe 4 or 5 years back, right?
So yeah, we'll dive into that bit a little bit more. But in your career, the next step was like a really good stint at Peloton as well, the company that we all have known about since COVID, and you were there right at the when everything was going wild at Peloton with all the subscribers and people buying Peloton during COVID. But you've had a fascinating career. When I was going back and looking at what you've done, you've been especially part of enterprises like Capital One, Peloton, and now at BNY, talking about cloud enablement, developer experience, and just helping the companies build these early prototypes that have turned into amazing products for them. So that's what I was like really curious to kind of talk to you about. So before we get to BNY and what you do, I mean, I wanted to start with, just talk about the piece that you were talking about. Like, how did that Capital One gig kind of come through, and what made you excited to get into that?
It was it kind of chose me. So before that, I was an IBM consultant at Capital One, working in the data center, like trying to coordinate all the hundreds of things that need to go into building infrastructure at a company that loves its requirements and at the time was still really waterfall. And I guess I was the one who cheated the most at that job. And so like I had the like my team had the fastest numbers, or I became a full timer at Cap One, and it was because we cheated. Like we we pre baked designs. We knew the things the architects were going to ask. We just kind of tried to we escalated our stuff through. But in the old days, like getting stuff done was hard, and so you kind of had to cheat. And when the gentleman Skip Potter, who now is the CDO CTO at Columbia, like came in to start the lab, he was like, "Well, you you seem like the only person that's getting stuff done here. Why don't you come work for me?" And so it went from me just being an average engineering manager in the company to something that really springboarded my career. It was exposure in the lab. This is again a while ago, to like concepts that you never really get in tech, like design thinking and really having some empathy to your customers. And for someone who was in infrastructure at the time, my customers are the devs trying to get work done, right? And so, we ended up rolling a whole CI/CD suite out for the lab and building tools specifically for the lab so the lab could move quickly. And then as Cap One matured, similar practices or exact same practices were adopted by the greater company. And so Cap One actually became an easy place for all devs to work to a certain extent. And, once I had my first couple projects that work out in the lab, I kind of rode one out and ended up getting into just, like I went from having like the smallest thing in the company, which is like all these lab pilots, to got to own most of the orchestrator and SRE operations behind everything that was customer facing at the company, which was super cool. It was kind of like you always hear when you're allowed, if anyone does listen to this, and if you're listening to this and you're working in an innovation zone, you've probably heard, well, how's that going to scale for the greater company? And there's no more fun way to prove people wrong than just take over the biggest thing they have that they're worried about and start applying those same practices to it. Yeah, yeah, it's just
That's awesome. So last time when I was talking to you, you told me like you were one of the biggest troublemakers at Capital One because you were one of the first people to kind of test out, the cloud and kind of bring that in. And now, in hindsight, and you can attest to this, Capital One is one of the biggest users of AWS. So tell me a little bit about that part, as to what led you to kind of believe that okay, this is the direction the company needs to go. Like cloud is important.
it was it wasn't that I was a good strategist, especially back then. It wasn't that I was a good futurist. It was just like, is the where's the resistance and where's the tension? And when you're trying to manage your data center as a company, that's probably not your specialty, right? Nothing feels fluid. Everything feels slow. Everything is baked in process, and also these are like a lot of data center management is there's a lot of just, here's the overhead behind us. Here's the project management behind this. This is the capacity planning behind us. It's hard to do. So it's a lot easier just to open a little Terraform, file and push go and have your infrastructure done for you, right? So from my perspective, we just started looking at things that were easier and faster. And as time went by, the rest of Cap One saw the same. There's, I was all pilots, little stuff, labby, versus that, once the value of the cloud was seen, like some of the like top execs in the company and some of these really high performing teams started rallying around the cloud. Next thing you know, like they're encouraging every new project to go there instead of sitting in the data center. And I was fortunate enough, because it's one thing to have cloud capabilities, it's another thing to have a team that knows what to do with them. I was fortunate enough at the time that I had a pretty software shaped team that was ready, willing, and excited about it and able to start getting stuff there. And so, it was one of the other execs in the company, and I had a joke, like which one of us can get our biggest platform to the cloud first, right? Like, and it was like just a gentleman's bet over who could probably more recklessly like throw something into the cloud. But we got the mobile app in there quick. Next thing, and all the other customer facing apps really quickly followed.
Right. So I wanted to ask, like, what was the culture before you started exploring that? Like, what was Capital One mostly? I know Capital One went through like a really big, uh, moment where they were like, we need to be the leading innovator in the banking space, and they were not really a bank, but like more of credit card kind of. approach, and
Yeah.
then it suddenly grew up. So when you joined the company, what was their perspective, and what did you feel they needed to kind of do in term to like, move into that innovation space?
Oh, now looking back, what I thought they should do, because
Yeah.
I didn't at the time, right? Like I joined in 2009, I think,
Nice.
and right around that same time period, maybe a little bit before, I think their current CIO like took the helm. I think Rob should probably get all the credit for what like a you're asked about the culture. The culture was already strong. It was a young company. It's founder led. If anyone's ever worked there, it's fun to work there, even if you're staring down obstacles and change controls and weird stuff. It had all the bones of greatness. Rob walked in and kind of, I don't say kind of, he saw outsourced development. He ended that. He saw a lack of bringing in our own talent. He started a college hire program. He started a lab. He did this. He did that. And so, like the building blocks were all going into place right around the time I was joining. And what followed, right? Once you start really inner sourcing and right, actually having an innovation agenda, moving away from contract development, moving away from other organizations managing your data centers and other important aspects of your company, good things tend to follow. And that combined with that founder-led nature that Cap One had, it just the next 10 years, I think anyone who was there during that journey, it was history. Like this thing went from like old-fashioned bank to like cloud-first business, like as quickly as I think anyone could go.
Right. Oh, that's awesome. So tell us a little bit more about one of the incubation projects that you started off in the lab and that turned into like a big, important, significant product for, Capital One. And then how did that take one example and kind of talk us through that journey of looking at the product, thinking about design, architecture, scale, all those things, the how you considered all of that?
Right, put the infrastructure guy on the spot for speaking
No,
to
we'll not
design.
go into details, but you can tell us the high level.
I did. One of the fun ones we were doing way back in the day, if you can remember, and this is a long time ago. Remember when the iPhone 6 came out?
Yep.
When iPhone 6 was a really big milestone for the Apple products, and I'll tell you how this ties into the bank at all. But it also was the iPhone that had Apple Pay,
Hmm.
and so most of the big banks got invited secretly into the conversation with Apple around how can we be a launch partner with Apple Pay. And the lab, along with partners in digital, all had to figure out exactly how we were going to get a companion app up running in a really short period of time for this launch, so that our customers have it, like can easily just pull up one of their Cap One cards, take a picture of it, and have it auto enroll into Apple Pay. And so that was a big partnership between the lab, greater architecture, greater digital engineering organizations, and that was kind of the ride out for me. Once we got that, I ended up being the infrastructure head on that project. And once it was up and rolling, it was time for that to graduate out of the lab and be run by a bigger organization. And,
Gotcha.
the healthy move to make was to go with the product.
Got it. Oh, I mean, that's amazing. So was that also like when you were creating the product, when you were designing the whole idea of how it all comes together, you have to definitely consider transactions and the scale at which these transactions happen. You have to consider compute. How did you go about recommending that? Like at that point, did you have like a set of architects who were educated enough? Because you also had the function of developer experience that you were slowly honing and bringing into the overall culture at Capital One. How did you
Not,
do
I
that?
mean, I wasn't doing any DevX work at Cap One,
Okay,
especially back
or
then. I
not
was
at
just, I was
Capital
just,
One.
I was
Okay,
just managing a couple tools.
okay,
But at the time, like, yeah, there's a lot of that. Most of the difficult part of the flow when Apple Pay first came out was more enrollment than
gotcha.
actual transaction loads. Cap One knows how to manage transactions, right?
Got it.
There are plenty of credit card swipes having over the course of a general day. For that, I think they
Right.
see like something like 8-9% of like all credit card transactions in the world, right? So
That's wild.
they not saying
9% is
scale
a
isn't
lot.
something that you plan out in a project like that, but for us and the infrastructure that I was working on specifically was enrollment.
But now let's take a little bit of a pivot back and maybe go back in time a little bit to a young Jason Valentino and kind of understand a little bit about where were you in terms of when you were finishing college and thinking about, hey, I need to get into tech, and what motivated you to get into this field of tech 20 years ago? Like, was there a trigger point, something that you saw that really excited you about the field?
It was just the the ability to create. And so I had like my own little mini business like towards the end of high school and into college, making websites for local businesses. Now, tell everybody how my age is, right? Like this is the late '90s, and if you could figure out that marquee tab, you were basically the greatest HTML programmer in the world at that period of time. So let's not get too impressed, but yeah, did a little web dev that was all self-taught way back in the day, which was super fun. And then as I was in school, having that, um, actually like just randomly met someone. I taught karate. Like I thought I'd be a professional kickboxer when I was a kid, and here we are not doing that. But like someone at the school was like, "I managed a tech team. Do you want to be my intern?" And so it went from like I went like my last dev gig was before I ever even got through college, right? And then next thing I know, it's I'm working back office at some weird pharmaceutical company, imaging computers and keeping servers running, and that just like within 6 months, I was a full time engineer on the staff and kept rolling from there.
Nice, that's awesome. And while you were doing that, did you ever anticipate that you're going to be like a head of engineering enablement somewhere down the line? Like, what were you thinking at that point of time?
Nope.
Like a dev career, is that where you were lined?
I honestly, and this is bad advice, like this is so counterintuitive to people that actually are really goal motivated or have really great growth mindsets. I've I've never really considered like my end game ever being further along than what I've done every 4 years of my career. It's just kind of like I accidentally keep leapfrogging where I think the ceiling is,
Right.
um, and I have no clue why or how.
That's funny. Well, but it's interesting when you say that, because I have seen a lot of people I've spoken to in my life who always feel like having a time period set for what they want to work on and accomplish is just way more simpler and much more, I would say, objective than saying, "Oh, in 20 years I want to be a CEO." When maybe you can become a CEO after four iterations of objective completions. You feel like you want to start a company and you've acquired enough knowledge. So I feel like that's a great advice also, like generally for people to be aware of, like, hey, think short, be clear about what you want to accomplish in that time period.
And I don't know if it's advice; it just worked for me. Like for me, it's just kind of like, hey, if I do this for 3 years, what do I want to work on next? It's kind of like I've always, if you ever had to read the terrible word vomit that is my resume, I've bounced between kind of EM and SRE and EM and SRE or whatever the at time period equivalent are over and over and over again, to the point where it's like they're both fun. They both like you can be really good at one and the other, and like have a great understanding of each other, like of what needs to be done to keep software running. um, but it only happens if you keep volunteering to bounce back and forth, right? Like I went like before Peloton, I was the de facto CTO of Cap One Shopping, running the full stack, learning way more about front end than I ever thought I would.
Yeah. So when you were saying, like, you're talking about EM and SRE, that's interesting because when I was talking to you, I've when you were saying that, I kind of realized that SREs have had a moment in the last decade, especially, with infrastructure and Kubernetes projects and container orchestration being so central to companies' scale and growth, right? And you've been part of that growth, at least at Capital One Shopping. You were talking about how, when we spoke last time, how containers became really quickly important for you. So tell us a little bit more about thinking like an SRE while also thinking about building a scalable product.
Yeah, and it was previous to shopping. The gig right before that was when I ran digital reliability, and the problem statement there, which most folks would listen to now, and it's pretty obvious and easy. But this is 6, 7 years, maybe 8 years back. Uh, you're in you get to the cloud. You have a well-designed app to run, on smaller increments. So you have microservices, micro experiences, but you have 150 to 200 of them, and you're just one app, right? You're not like the whole company's ecosystem. And this is pre-containers, so yeah, and you're at a company that really insists you need this many availability zones and this many live regions. Next thing you know, your AWS bill is It's more than you're ever going to make an income in your life, right? So you got to do something about that. And for us, like that necessitated, moving to container-based delivery, which we did. We built a custom hosting app using Hashi's Nomad at the time. Kubernetes wasn't right for us just yet, and the company's really made strides from what I can tell since I've left there. But then also you also just consider, like, in your architecture, for us in digital reliability, those services, most of those called back to something else deeper down in the depths of the bank, right? And so you never really think about it, but if whoever your retail bank is, if you look at that mobile app, you know, there's your profile picture, there's your bank balance, there's your credit card balance, there's something else there, there's a bunch of other services, and those aren't coming from the team that manages that mobile app, right? They're coming from somewhere deep down in the company. And I think we just as many, services as we had that many or more dependencies on other folks. And so when you get to a point where you're delivering content, on behalf of the rest of the organization, you kind of got to, like, play it like Netflix, right? Easy thing to do is just steal their stack, borrow open source, cool. But get to a point where you're using defensive programming. You have circuit breakers set up for everything behind you. You have quick ways of filtering and like having request filtering if something evil gets out into that mobile app. But you have to get to the point where if someone else in your company is having a bad day, the customer doesn't know about it. Your portion of the application can absorb it. Like, that being the case, like, it was really, really easy to have, like, to say, hey, look at my uptime. My uptime is great. Don't ask me about every component, like, in every backend dependency you've ever had. If you have just 100 dependencies, like, and your uptime metric is like, 99.99, like, someone's gonna break every couple days, and that's to be expected. Design around it.
Right. Oh, that's amazing. I mean, and I wanted to get your thoughts too, because I've thought about this often, and off late I've had a few conversations with really good, SRE folks, and kind of it also feels like you have some amazing experience there, right? 15 years ago, I would go to a website and the website wasn't hitting. I was like, okay, I'll just go back and tell, somebody from my crew, hey, this is not working. Okay, we'll wait for the to book the ticket for the next concert when the website comes back up. But today you cannot do that. Today something goes down immediately. You have people throwing a tantrum on Twitter, or now, call it Instagram threads or wherever it is, and everybody knows immediately, and kind of hits the reputation of the company, hits the customer experience. So tell me about how much, when you're designing systems, you have to consider these kind of situations.
When it comes to looking at stuff like customer impacts, error budgets, whatnot, like, for me, it's more, I just relive every incident retro I've ever had in my head, and I try to think through, like, because how many, like, in the old days, you used to sit at them and, like, someone would be like, how do we not catch this in testing? Or like, like, well, how could you put this problem in there? And, like, you blame the people. And instead of just recognizing humans are flawed. I'm a super flawed human. And so I commiserate with this. How do we make the software a little bit more elastic, to actually allow for a couple human errors here and there? We at Peloton, we had, like, a pretty significant outage. And the one thing I really respected about Peloton is they were really good. The IM practices they put together were quite good and quite blameless. And so it was very easy to step out of a public outage and go, wow, okay, I do want a paper on how that happened, why that happened. I also want recommendations from the engineering community on, if something similar were to happen, how could we survive it without, like, this being a problem that exacerbates some other underlying thing that's designed poorly that fails the company at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
long story short, assume we all are going to mess up, and
Yeah.
try to design your software as such.
Yeah, it's funny. It kind of reminded me, what you said was the first job I got ever, tech job, was in a team where I had to do development, testing, and support. But within that team, I had to do support first. So I was the youngest guy, and this is my first day. And I was working for a consulting company at the time, which was working for British Telecom. and British Telecom had a solution called ADSL. Basically, what you could do is you could go and put in your postcode or your zip code, and it would tell you, hey, what bandwidth is available, and other retail companies would buy that to sell different broadband solutions back in the UK. So this is the first day of job. I'm doing the evening shift, which is like 7 o'clock in the evening, and I have one guy with me. They say it's a P1 because apparently the entire website went down. So and so when you say SREs, I was like, that moment I was like, dude, I don't know what to do over here, But then we went through the process, look at different tickets, and back in the day, what people would do is, well, it seems like it's upstream teams' issue. So we would send tickets to each other, play table tennis over there. But we eventually found the issue was that somebody, when they checked in the code in the last release, forgot to add a function, and that was really important, that would check a certain variable, and then that was the reason why it was erroring out, and then the whole website would go down because of that. So we have gone way past that in today's system, because we are building not monolithic application but microservices, and we release a microservices API or different functions, and they run in containers, maybe on an AKS system or a GKE, and then the maturity has been fantastic. So how do you feel about where we have come in the last 15 years? It's been fantastic, and especially for where you are, it would be a very good perspective to kind of see all of this.
And just the best part about it, it's if when Gene Kim first wrote the Phoenix Project, like you could read it and you commiserate with it, and it told you what was wrong, but like you looked at your own team and you're like, it's going to take a while before this is right. And then you speed up to God knows how many books later, right, to the modern day. And the average engineering manager cares about their uptime, cares about the stability of their system, right? And just getting to a point where we've moved away from a world where there's ops and there's development, and we're all incentivized differently, and we all have different opinions on what we need to do next, right? It's just kind of like getting to a point where the teams now have autonomy to actually yeah, I care about the stability of my application. Yeah, this is not only is stability a first class citizen, but so is design, so is just the overall architecture of mine. I think just getting to a point where we all have more ownership over everything was probably the biggest win I've seen in the last decade.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I was going to ask you, I mean, you went from, of course, you're an engineering manager, so looking at engineering enablement, you've had great SRE experience, but you've also been a great leader, right? You've built lots of different teams, and what's your leadership style? Like, how do you inculcate different ideas on how teams need to kind of build or follow actively on what the objectives are and things associated with the goals?
Okay, I don't know where you heard that I was a good leader, but okay, we'll work with it. We'll go
Well,
on
I
the
would say
operating
I
assumption.
generally give everyone the benefit of the doubt and say they were
Love
good
it.
at everything.
Fantastic. Okay. So for me, it's a highly effective team is one that can move quickly without my input or without my leader's inputs, right? And so I tend to be my goal is to be hands off. My goal is to let the team's charter, the team's operating principles work for themselves. My job is more help folks get what they know they need from the greater organization in order to get their jobs done. Run people through exercises they haven't. So an example of that is I have a team that feels like it's understaffed right now. Objectively, they're probably understaffed based on what I've seen for similar teams. But how do you display that information in a way that you're going to get buy-in from others, right? So with that team, it's kind of sitting there and going, here's how I would tell the story. I would explain, show all the things you do, show what the priority one, declare what is priority one for all of these different apps that you support. Show how much staff goes into that important part, and then somehow show where product intent falls in that list, right? And so just it's teaching people the tools that I developed along the way. B, making sure we have a really strong charter. I don't think of a charter as a check the box, hey, I need to have this document. I see it as something that actually teaches the people on the team what our priorities are, how to scale. how to actually assess new priorities, like what our mission is, what decisions that like how I'd like them approaching decisions if I'm not in the room, because I don't want to be in the room. Like I just would rather, a strong team is one that can at the lowest level of the team make the same call as the person at the top of it.
Right.
And I probably do some other stuff too. I don't know. Call somebody that has worked for me and just
Yeah,
find out what's
after this, I'm going to
most.
call one of your employees or somebody who worked for you.
Yeah, yeah,
But I
yeah.
think what you said is very interesting, right? Like leadership sometimes you have to step in and inspire, but sometimes you also have to let the teams kind of figure out how do you want to communicate upwards. So they need to learn that themselves. And have you had instances where you are trying to make a decision on what product to choose, and there's really been confusion, and then you have to step in and say, okay, we need to look at these fundamental objectives before deciding, and we've had a challenge like that before.
Sure. To me, I think it's more. It's not a step in when the decision like is trying to be made. It's more of a start with guiding principles. And so, when approaching a big project, it's kind of the what is my job? Is my job to tell everyone to go design something, and then at the end of it, shit all over the design, or is it to say? And I don't mean like requirements. I mean like, hey, I want to actually paint the guiding principles story. Why we're doing this, what's the history here, like I want to fill people who may not be familiar with the project in along the way. I want this to be very consumable, like story, right? Like, hey, maybe the company's tried this 3 times and this is the 4th time, and like here's what went wrong, right? And then going into it, say like, hey, for me to be happy as the sponsor, boss, whatever my name is today, like here's what needs to be true at the end of this, and then share that with the world. Share it with the world and get the world to also chime in, because I want to hear from the other leaders what would, and then their folks, what would make this project successful. And then if I hand that to my team and I say, now you're in design phase, they're gonna make something great, right? Like the expectations already been set, like everyone's already chimed in on what they generally want. Sure, there's some versions of it, and this to me is all internal customers in this particular example, but like, there's going to be some comments on how we design it along the way, but the expectations already set that we are going to design, we are going to build something that does do this. And so for me, it's kind of just one of those. I think my job is to listen to people, tell them, like regurgitate what I think they told me as far as what they want my team to work on, um, then somehow come back and say, hey, my team has designed this thing, could you read this and make sure it's the thing that you said that you wanted me to work on? And then as we build it, say, demo the thing and say, hey, is this still the thing you asked for and said was the most important thing? It's just kind of like that. If you can create that quick feedback loop over and over and over again, as something, especially someone who works in engineering tools, like by the time you roll it out, everyone's like, it's here, it's fantastic. Instead of the, hey, we think we know how to make your problem going away and then just disappearing. And like a year later coming back with something that everyone forgot about and no one really like has their eyes on anymore.
Yeah,
So
yeah. No, I think that when you said that, I was exactly thinking the same word, that what you're creating is like a very good, efficient feedback loop. Before you commit to something and you're so down the pipe, you realize that, oh, you went a totally different direction. It's great. I mean, so that was amazing. That I was also thinking in the similar vein on, what you were trying to say. Uh, I wanted to jump back to some of the things that you were talking about engineering tools. I wanted to understand, what is it that you use the most or have used in the last decade that you feel is a phenomenal technology that changed the game for everybody?
it's GitLab, GitHub. It's so simple. It's so boring. But I'll tell you this: like I know that's a boring cop out answer, especially for someone that spends very little time in either. Um, the like if anyone follows like DevX and has looked at the space framework, right, and surveys and stuff, previously, like I'm a big fan of DevX surveys. I think you get some of the best data you're going to from just asking people, how does this work? How's your day, right? But I also used to we used to cheat at Peloton, and we used to also add like a section that'd be like, hey, check off which of these tools you use, and it would be like everything related to software development in the entire company. And at the top of that list, over and over and over again, was always GitHub, right? Like it's just like this is the one thing that you got. Like, we don't have a lot of custom work on the implementation, obviously, but like it's just out of box, does what everyone expects it to. It's well understood. it's a necessity for everybody that everybody likes versus a necessity for everybody that everybody dislikes, hates, or puts up with, right?
Yeah. So describe for folks who are listening, what is developer experience? Like maybe folks don't get that. Like, can you simplify that for some people as to what is developer experience? Why is it important for enterprises to have something like that in practice?
Yeah. So um, if you think about your engineers at a company like the size of the one that I'm working for or previously worked for, it's probably the majority of your product. It's the majority, like they're building your entire company around you, right? If you're Cockroach, it's 100% true, right? Um, why not take the time to to measure and to move forward an agenda that helps make them as productive, happy, and engaged as humanly possible? And so DevX sets out to do just that. In some organizations, DevX may be the group that solely does the product research around this and solely builds the strategy around this. In other groups, it may be also encompassing of some of the tooling that you'd want that team to have direct control of. In my world, it's a little of both, right? So we're working now to get a little bit more of a product feel on it, but make sure we're interviewing developers. We're running surveys. We're looking at actual data from what's happening in Jira, what's happening in GitLab, what's happening in our CI tools to see what the state of the union is. Taking that, distilling it down, and then for the things that we have direct control of. So for me, that happens to be CI, SCM, right? Um, yeah, okay, I know how to solve these problems. I have direct control. It's very easy to change things you control. The harder part of it is how do you bring, like, you're not the top, like you're not running the rest of the company. How do you influence others? How do you take that data in a really compelling way, put it in front of the rest of the organization so that they go, ah, you are right. The way we do X is problematic for the goal here, which is, developer engagement and developer enablement.
Yeah. I mean, it's been interesting too, because last 10, 15 years, there's been a shift in trends, right? Like we saw the cloud platforms coming, and then platforms will have their own specific products and databases and services. And then we had a phase where we had, open source technology kind of boom up. We had projects like Spark. We have projects like, Cockroach is an open source project as well. Lots of open source projects, and developers want to like try these out and kind of use these in projects. But 10, 15 years ago, the open source was not something that would relatively be easy to squeeze into any company, be alone a financial company. Hey, they were so critical. So did you have phases where developers came back to you and said, no, we need to use this open source project, this is really good, this is the direction? And how did you go about kind of considering that into the overall developer experience?
For tool selection and what should we use and what can we use, normally on that interview question, I just immediately punt to the paper, the Netflix Golden Path, which is like the story of, hey, right, like maybe I'm a regulated industry. In my example, I'm a regulated industry, and there's a little less regulated probably, but there's a lot of tools. Tools are good. I don't want to be the person to say, no, you shouldn't use this for your use case, right? I don't want to be that one like magical architect that needs to review everything that goes in a company. What I'd rather do instead is say, hi, my job is do JSON stuff. This seems like a tool that falls into JSON stuff's arena. Um, I have all the data on what people like using, what people don't like using, which tools cost more, which tools cost less, like which we find that developers are generally effective with. I'm going to build this paved path for people that want to use this tool that meets 80% of the need or whatnot. But I'm not going to stop people that are in this strange, like other 20% from doing their job. Just know the barrier of entry is going to be harder because I've already covered all this thing for the people that adopt this. Um, and so like I like the golden path concept from Netflix in that it's standardization to make things easy for people that choose the standard. It doesn't squash the great ideas and the innovation that comes from folks that need to go a different path, right?
Right, right,
And then
right. No.
in the event people go down that road, and find that weird database or find that weird tool that we have something similar in the company, but that doesn't meet a need, and it shows value through their work, then that becomes the next thing that also falls into the standard list, right? It's just
Right.
doesn't
Yeah.
start that way.
I mean, we're talking about cracking a bunch of eggs in the process, right? But which is expected to have when you think about innovation as being central to building out a cool product. And to what I was trying to say was with that is you've had phases, and then we had Kubernetes, and now we're at a phase where we have generative AI, right? And I know you are working at BNY Mellon, so anything generative AI and codes getting used can be tricky, especially in the financial space. But lots of developers today are trying to use, say, Microsoft GitHub Copilot, and there is a lot of value that they get. I mean, really good boilerplate code, right? So has that come up, or are you thinking about how that fits into the overall developer story?
Oh my god, like yeah. Like, I mean, not a little bit. I think it's like Copilot is cool, FYI. But like anything that's going to make people's jobs easier, anything that's going to be like helping them build portions of their code and doing it in a really like innovative way is going to be good. And I won't go ahead and I won't tell you what pilots we've got underway at the company because I don't think I signed the right communication form to do so. But like I do see like generative AI, even the evolution of prompt engineering being super super cool. I think it's all win. It's like getting to a point where like all the care and feeding that needs to go into, well, like we're gonna say like healthy quality driven code, like some of it like starting to magically appear around you as you're working. It's fantastic.
Yeah. So I was just talking to, like, in the morning today. Interestingly, I was speaking to another person who is also from Austin, Texas. I'm not sure if he's your neighbor, but we were
Possibly.
talking.
We don't go outside right now. It's 108 degrees out there.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah, it's pretty damn hot here in Dallas too. But when we were talking, he was also mentioning this whole push for using generative AI. But in that whole experience, there he mentioned something that was really profound: the fact that generative AI can give you a really good function, right? If you ask for, hey, give me this function, it can give you that really good function, and it can accelerate your code timing from, say, 30 minutes to, say, 15 minutes. But you still have to spend another 5 minutes just to refine that and turn it into what it needs to be for your enterprise. Do you think that enterprises today who are talking about generative AI are also considering putting proper guidelines to allow innovation, yet at the same time make sure that there are checks placed in to make sure that we are not just copying paste code that's written by somebody else at some other company?
I would assume so. The cool thing is, like, I think most people are starting with things like Copilot, which are going to come with some Rails right outside, like or coming on Rails. It's not like just be like, "Hey, Chat GPT, could you write this for me?" I think folks are going to like. I think the bigger companies are very wary of sending any question out to like a GPT engine out in the middle of nowhere, right, and seeing what comes back, right? But if folks are starting smaller, I think they're safer. I'm sure as this evolves, like the companies that love controlling things will find like various like control points are needed. They're going to have to put in it. I'm sure the startups will just be like, whatever it runs. Like there'll be a good mix in between too.
Yeah, I think so. So I wanted to also understand, your work at Peloton, what you did, that was like a very interesting role, because you were there to like bring this whole team that's being running at such a fast pace, and there is so much demand for the product, and you need to innovate, and developers are just going crazy using different things. What was that role like in an environment where there was suddenly a fire, and you were like, damn, like this rocket ship is not slowing down? How did you work on that?
Oh, I don't know. It was fun. Like the cool thing was is I inherited a lot of the folks that helped get it off the ground. It wasn't like I showed up with like a team of 20 new people that were like, "Hello, Peloton, what are you?" Right? And it all happened in logical succession too. So, as the number of developers grew, the ability to get things done safely gets harder and harder and harder. Like there's no more just like, well, hey, so and so built this part of the code base, let me call them. So and so built this part, let's call them. Um, you know, the app became more critical. The app became more complex. And right around the same time, the company was realizing maybe that like every post IPO X startup, right? There's big monolithic like leftover code from that, from the time you were running as fast as you possibly could. And they were also in the process of, well, let's figure out what the standard microservice should look like. Let's figure out like what our new stack should be, because we're getting like, we know a new stack will unlock velocity, and the old stack is something we're going to have to figure out a strategy around. And so I was kind of fortunate in that DevX was something that the other devs in the company were asking for. So building the DevX function, fairly seamless. Like, people were waiting for us to show up, and that was fantastic.
That's
Like,
good.
it
Yeah.
was like I sat in with like every VP in the company in my first 2 weeks, and they were all in unison about what I should work on
Right.
first, right? And between that, like doing the little things that a company that gets to that critical moment needs, getting our product, like, our internal, like, uh, platform, product team together, getting our tech learning team together to help with things like onboarding and teaching the new skills that were necessary to move to these new stacks. All of it was really like, I felt super welcome there, super welcome. Like the time, like they pulled us in at the very right time. I think like if they grew more, DevX might probably would have been harder to introduce. If it was any sooner, it might have been overkill, and then for like 5 devs sitting around looking at each other.
Yeah, it's always good to come into an environment where everybody feels there is a need for something rather than somebody saying, "Hey, we need this," and this guy is going to build it. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, it's just much more friendlier. I feel that way to kind of build.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fortunately, like DevX is a real like for good devs expect this.
Yeah,
And so it's kind of one of those where, whether you find a way to do it local, find a way to do it, like, just push a little bit of culture, right? It's something that no one's going to be like, yeah, we don't need that. You know what
yeah,
I hate is someone caring about how I feel and how productive I am. Like, I despise that. Right.
yeah. It's funny. Uh, so there's so much happening in the tech space, right? In the industry, where do you go and keep up to date with what's happening? Like, you have a very important role now with BNY, and every other role that you've had, there's some sort of significance, right? And you also have different stuff that you are doing in your life. Where do you go to kind of look for inspiration, look for stuff that needs to be learned that you can apply within your enterprise?
Right. For me, it's because I'm working at companies that um, aren't Google, right? It's I read a lot of the white papers that come out of the Googles of the world, of the like the Dora research teams of the world, because they're solving problems. Like, they're sprinting and solving problems as they're sprinting, and I'm working on a company that at the moment like needs to get out of the crawl phase, right? And so for me, it's I unfortunately don't have to be, but so much of a futurist, because people are solving this for way harder problems, and I'm looking and I'm reading those papers and going, oh, either that'd be a nice problem to have, or that is a genius way of approaching this. I'm totally stealing that and adopting it, and I will give whoever wrote this paper credit, like, at the bottom of my deck. So I do a lot of reading, just random papers on productivity studies. Um, Avi Noda's Engineering Enablement podcast, amazing. I'm a big fan of Gene Kim's IdeaCast. And so, I try to spend maybe just an hour or two a week just learning from people that are doing it better than me, most likely. And, and getting ideas. And like, I've come with my new team now, it's like we have a little like blog book club too. Like, if, it shouldn't just be me, right? Like, I've got like 200 folks that are brilliant and have better ideas than I do. And just kind of like taking turns sharing what was the last cool, interesting thing you ran into, right? Like, what technology are you guys paying attention to? Like, it goes a long way.
I mean, the fascinating thing about what you just said is also that you have so many people who are also actively trying to get better, learn new things. And it's about the challenge also, it persists where how do you take all these 200 people, get the best 5 ideas, then translate that into that one idea that will work for the company, right? Like, so do you get into things where you see two good ideas and you're like, damn, I mean, I want to apply both of them, but I just don't know how to
Just
how to go
greenlight
about making
everything.
those decisions.
Money's
It's a good
infinite.
problem to have, but go ahead.
Uh,
Yeah.
I generally just want to hear, like, with the team, especially the size of mine, it's more, um, Yeah, and my old boss at Peloton, Jim Hogwat, was the one that kind of taught me this technique. It's like, I want to hear their stories from the future. Like I want, like, it's really easy to sit and try to prioritize two things. What are the two next steps we should take? And you can, like, you don't have a grading model for what to do next. But if you just actually sit down and instead say, where do we want to be in 3 years? Like, does my job even exist in 3 years? Let's start there. Like, what does the average developer's day look like? What does the average database unit, like DBA's day, look like? Like, what does the actual org look like? What are we doing? What's going to be good? What does fast look like? And then you get an agreement on what the future is supposed to look like, the ideal future. And then all of a sudden, like, you find people just start aligning much more easily towards the, like, what to do next. Like, it's no longer hard. It's kind of like, oh, if we're getting there, here's the sequence, right? I don't know if that directly answered the question, but
I get the feel of where you're going for it. Like, so basically, what you're saying is that the the thing is for you to understand, like, what are those key things, and then once you identify that, everybody kind of aligns to uh, what that one thing needs to be.
yeah. It's kind of like we do that through everything. It's like our KRs, right? Like, but not just the KRs themselves. Just what's the story? Like, hey, 3 years from now, new BNY and engineer sits down. How quickly did they get to their first PR, right? How seamless was setting up their IDE, right? Like, how quick is it to get a technical inquiry from another team to find out how to integrate with their API, right? Like you start going through those, and then you start looking at the metrics. What of those things is the hardest today, and they start to define themselves as the most important thing to probably chase.
Got it. Yeah. And do you think that having cloud platforms and having these ready-made, already maintained, SaaS products in the market, do you think that has added value to developers so that they don't have to think about, okay, I just need to know how to use this product rather than learn how to deploy, manage, run. Do you think that's helped your team and or teams that you worked with before? Yeah.
Some, it depends. Like, if you're talking about just cloud technology, maybe the layer on top of it, absolutely. Like, right, like, get like things that help CD go fast. Very good. I'm hesitant to say I'm in love with kind of like CI/CD out of a box yet. Like, I haven't found a product yet. Like, and there's ones that all have great components of something that I want, right? But there's not one where it's like, if I just did this, there'd be no customization necessary, and man, all you click commit, and life is great, right? Like that doesn't exist yet, but it will, right? Like, at some point.
Talk to me about like, is it like Netlify, Amplify? Have you explored those products that do CI/CD automation and deployments for you? Have you explored any of those?
Netlify is cool. Like, we I think Peloton's a customer, and they use them for the front end deployments. I think, like, all of them are good for like a single use case, or maybe two, right? It's like, I'm really waiting for one of them to just sweep in and be like, we own your entire deployment suite, right? Like, I just don't see it just yet.
What are the other tools? I know there have been some interesting tools in the space right now that I'm exploring myself for my stuff, like for managing. Do you think Notion? Have you explored Notion by any
I
chance
have
as a
not. I have
productivity
not.
tool?
Mm-mm.
Okay, yeah,
What's it
I
do?
think
Should I know about this? Am I calling myself out in public forum by not knowing what it is?
no, well, I don't know if, like, we know we have Confluence, right, as like one of those
Yeah.
places where folks go put stories and they can put their documentation and things like that. But I feel like I have seen Notion as being is this new platform that's like AI supported that allows you to do whatever you want to. Like, you can create, you have multiple templates available, and folks can use it for their own personal, you know, tracking of things and project progress and things like that. So I found it pretty interesting. I've been using it myself. So yeah, maybe something that I can share with you that you can go and explore. It's called, I
You
think the
just did,
website is called
and it's up on my other
notion.so.
workstation here now, so I would definitely look at this.
Yeah. No, it's awesome. Yeah. Well, Jason, I mean, I wanted to ask you, as we kind of come to the close of, you've been so generous with your time and sharing all these amazing ideas. What is your ideal advice to anybody who is in this process of, trying to build platform engineering or great SRE teams as to what are the few things that they should be doing to kind of build a great team?
I think when it comes to just anything platforming in general, um, I think inviting, like, getting real product managers involved is probably like one of the biggest game changers you can. I see so much, like, companies all kind of want the same thing. Is they want to develop great stuff. They want to make sure they're promoting reuse inside the company, be that open source or other, right? And I think a lot of us get hung up on the question of how does adoption happen? And I think it's very easy when you have the hammer, you have the power to just order adoption of your platforms, right? To say, I built this, it's going to save the company millions and millions of dollars. Adopt my thing. What is wrong with you? Why don't you like this, right? Be that a pipeline, piece of software, this, that, or another. And I really just, I don't see success in that. Like, unless you're actually measuring that, like, what's the NPS score of the thing I built, for what I want to build? What are my product managers telling me the biggest problems are inside my organization? Like, can I actually make people happy by existing? Once you start to unpack that a little bit, I think you start moving. Like, you can't move in a wrong direction at that point. It's just, it's like, I don't know. It's like, do you want to be the DMV, or do you want to be the platform that everyone, like, is really proud of, that talks to their peers in the industry about, that says, oh, this is how we do it here, right? Like, and this was great, and the devs love it, the customers love it, everyone's happy with it, solves this problem, right? So, long story short, I don't think there's enough, and this is coming from someone that's done nothing but chase bits around all his life and has no formal product manager training. I think figuring out the voice of your customer, in my line of business, that's the developer, figuring out that voice and working backwards from it is probably the most important thing you could do.
That's brilliant. So, where else do you think? I mean, you have shared some amazing advice. I mean, some really great comments, I would say, on this, podcast. And for everyone listening, Jason's amazing. I mean, he's got a pretty, I would say, decently active LinkedIn profile. Where I've seen that you've interacted. Where else can people kind of follow you? Is there a blog place or a Substack, or something that you do on LinkedIn where people can follow you and kind of catch you?
LinkedIn is probably the most useful. And occasionally I'll remember to push the, like, post to Twitter button on LinkedIn when I'm publishing something primarily on LinkedIn. So that's generally going to be it. And I try to pin, in, like, this podcast, I try to pin stuff that I actively, like, authored. I just have gotten lazy at it. We'll get better. This will inspire me to be better. Also, David, I don't know about you, but when the whole pandemic happened, like, I didn't make the transition from, like, on stage in conferences to, like, doing this. Like, it isn't until after COVID, I'm like, I guess I could start talking to people again. Like, this sounds like fun. So
I generally feel like everyone who's been in the space, especially last 10, 15 years, who's worked on innovative products such as you, has so many great stories to share, And if I have to leave you with anything, I feel like I just would say there is more Jason needed in the world, Like, so we need more of you, in the sense, like, you have great experience, like how you have been inspired by what Netflix has done. I think some of the things that you have done, putting it together in a place, or like as you shared in today's podcast, just helps so many people. And that's how great communities, great open source communities, and great ideas are passed around. So I feel like we need a little bit more of that, and I'm glad that you took the time to come on the podcast and talk about it with us.
that's
So
awesome.
it's awesome.
No, thank you, David. You're way too kind.
Yeah, I am kind, but you are too good. And I appreciate you hopping on.